There are places in the West where the wind doesn't just pass through, it hunts. And in a forgotten town called Red Hollow Ridge, a woman who had become invisible was about to be offered something no one else dared to give her: a life, in exchange for everything she believed in. When a silent rancher walked into her schoolhouse and asked for a wife, not love, not romance, just survival, she thought it was madness. But what if saying yes would pull her into a war of land, blood, betrayal, and a truth buried deeper than the soil itself? Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about a marriage of convenience. This is a story about what happens when two broken lives collide in the harshest corner of the Wild West. If this story moved you, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who needs it. And don't forget to like and subscribe to follow more journeys from the Wild West.
The wind didn't just blow in Red Hollow Ridge. It hunted. It cut through the gaps in the timber like a promise of suffering, carrying the scent of dying grass and the bitter taste of mountain dust. Abigail Rowan stood at the warped window of the one-room schoolhouse, her palm pressed against the glass. Outside, the world was a study in shades of brown and exhausted gold. She watched the last student, a spindly boy of 10, disappear over the horizon. His father hadn't even looked at her when he'd collected him. He'd simply gripped the boy's shoulder and turned away, as if acknowledging a 33-year-old spinster might somehow contaminate his own precarious standing in this stubborn, starving settlement. "Invisible," Abigail whispered, her breath fogging the pain. "That's what you've become, Abby." She turned back to the room. It was the smallest structure in town, a cramped box that smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke. To the town, she was a utility, something they used but didn't want to see. She was paid $75 a year to teach arithmetic to children who would mostly grow up to break their backs against the same soil that was currently burying the town in dust. The door creaked. Abigail hadn't heard the boots on the porch. The wind usually swallowed every sound, but the man filling her doorway seemed to swallow the light itself. He had to be 6'4", with shoulders so broad they seemed to strain against the very frame of the building. He wore work clothes that had seen better decades, canvas pants held up by thick leather suspenders, and a shirt that might have been blue before the sun had bleached the life out of it. His face was a map of hard angles and sun-damaged skin, but it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were the color of creek water in midwinter, clear, cold, and a haunting shade of gray. He held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly. It was a gesture of uncharacteristic hesitation for a man who looked like he spent his life wrestling the earth into submission. "Miss Rowan," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel shifting at the bottom of a dry well. Abigail straightened her spine, hating the slight tremor in her hands. "Can I help you? The school day is over." "Name's Caleb Vance." She knew the name. Everyone in the ridge knew the Vance Ranch. It was a massive spread past Miller's Creek, thousands of acres of prime grazing land, and a house built of stone and timber that looked like it could withstand an apocalypse. Caleb Vance was the hermit king of that fortress, a man who rarely spoke and never lingered in town. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice regaining its teacher's edge. He nodded once, his gaze moving to the books stacked on her desk, then to the careful handwriting on the chalkboard. "I'll be direct, Miss Rowan. I'm not good at anything else." Outside, a loose shutter banged against the wall once, twice, then fell silent. "I need a wife," he said. The words hung in the air like something physical, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Abigail felt a hot flush creep up her neck. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then managed a strangled, "I beg your pardon?" "A wife," Caleb repeated, his expression unreadable. "Winter's coming hard this year. I've got a ranch to run, cattle to keep alive, and work that needs doing by someone who isn't me. I need help. I need partnership." "Partnership?" Abigail's voice climbed an octave. "You don't even know me, Mr. Vance. You walk into my schoolhouse and speak as if you're inquiring about the price of a heifer. Caleb met her eyes, unflinching. I know enough. You're educated, you're capable. You've been teaching here for 5 years without a single complaint from the board. I've asked around. You're alone, and from what I gather, you're likely to stay that way unless something changes. The bluntness of it felt like a slap. It was the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like having a wound exposed to the frost. That is an incredibly rude thing to say, she snapped. It's honest, Caleb countered. I'm not offering romance, Miss Rowan. I'm offering survival. You've got skills I need. Reading, accounts, a steady hand. I've got stability you don't. The town's already made up its mind about you. How long before the school board decides they'd rather have a younger, cheaper girl from the east? Abigail felt a twist in her chest. He had seen the one thing she feared most, her own obsolescence. Get out, she whispered. I'm offering you a home, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. Security, respect, the kind that comes with being a Vance. It's more than you've got now. I said, get out! Caleb put his hat on slowly, deliberately. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had made a fair bid and was prepared to wait for the market to turn. I'll give you 3 days to think on it, he said, stepping back into the threshold. After that, the offer is gone. I need to get supplies in before the first snow, and I need to know if I'm buying for 1 or 2. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. For what it's worth, I'm not a bad man. I work hard, I don't drink more than I should, and I've never raised a hand to anything that didn't deserve it. You might want to consider if your pride is worth more than a warm house and a full stomach. Then he was gone. The door remained open, and the cold October air rushed in, carrying the smell of dust and the lonely, echoing silence of the prairie. Abigail stood frozen, her hands shaking. She grabbed the nearest book, a heavy Latin grammar, and hurled it at the door. Bastard! She yelled into the wind. But as the echoes died away, a quieter, colder voice in the back of her mind whispered the truth she hated most. He's right. The 3 days Abigail spent in the boarding house were a slow, suffocating death by 1,000 whispers. Mrs. Talbot had stopped serving her the extra heel of bread at breakfast, and Mr. Green, the town's resident drunkard, had taken to leaning against the schoolhouse fence, watching her with a predatory, pitying grin. The school board had already sent a letter, not a firing notice, but an inquiry into her long-term intentions, a thinly veiled warning that a woman of her age, unmarried and unattached, was a liability to the town's moral fabric. So, when the dawn of the 3rd day broke gray and heavy with the scent of impending snow, Abigail didn't wait for Caleb Vance to knock. She stood on the porch of the boarding house with her single trunk, her best wool shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Caleb arrived exactly as he said he would. He drove a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 massive draft horses that looked as immovable as the mountains they hailed from. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply stepped down, the boards of the porch groaning under his weight, and hoisted her trunk as if it were filled with feathers rather than a lifetime of books and memories. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Abigail's chest. "I am sure of the alternative, Mr. Vance," she replied, her chin tilted high. "And the alternative is a slow starvation of the soul. Let's go." The ride to the Vance Ranch was a lesson in the vastness of the American West. Red Hollow Ridge shrank into a collection of toy houses, and soon there was nothing but the rolling amber of the high plains and the jagged white-capped teeth of the Rockies to the west. Caleb didn't speak. He drove with a terrifying focus, his hands calloused and scarred, holding the reins with a gentleness that contradicted his size. When the ranch finally came into view, Abigail gasped. It wasn't a shack or a soddy. It was a fortress of stone and heavy cedar, nestled in a valley where a creek snaked through groves of golden cottonwoods. It looked permanent. It looked safe. "This is it," Caleb said, gesturing to the house. My father built the foundation. I finished the rest. He led her inside, and the air shifted. The house was clean, but it was the cleanliness of a barracks, utilitarian, cold, and devoid of a woman's touch. He showed her to her room on the left side of the house. To her surprise, a sturdy iron lock had been freshly installed on the door. "You have the key," he said, looking at the floor. "I'm a man of my word, Abigail. This is a partnership. Your space is your own." That evening, the silence of the ranch felt heavier than the silence of the schoolhouse. Caleb sat across from her at the kitchen table, eating the salt pork and beans she had prepared, with an efficiency that bordered on the mechanical. "I have questions, Caleb," she said, using his Christian name for the first time. It felt like a spark in a dark room. He looked up, his creekwater eyes guarded. "Ask." "You said you needed an educated wife. For the accounts, you said. But you've run this place for 7 years alone. Why now?" Caleb's jaw tightened. He reached into the pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a crumpled, official-looking envelope. He slid it across the table toward her. His fingers lingered on the paper, a strange, vulnerable tension in his shoulders. "Read it," he muttered. Abigail opened the letter. It was from the Bitter Creek Land Office, a formal notice of foreclosure inquiry regarding a secondary loan. The language was dense, filled with legalese and predatory clauses. "They say I owe money I don't remember borrowing," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They sent 3 of these. I can make out the numbers. I can see the Vance name. But the rest of the words—" He stopped, a deep flush of shame creeping up his weathered neck. Abigail looked from the letter to the man who stood 6'4" and could wrestle a bull to the ground. The king of the ridge was functionally illiterate. He wasn't just looking for a cook or a companion. He was looking for a shield. He was being hunted by men with pens because he only knew how to fight men with guns. "You can't read this, can you?" she asked softly. Caleb stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "I can read the land. I can read a storm. But the marks men make on paper to steal from each other? No. I never had the time to learn, and my father—" He bit back whatever he was going to say about Thomas Vance. "Will you help me, Abigail? Or is the deal off now that you know you married a fool?" Abigail stood too, moving around the table until she was close enough to smell the pine and iron on him. "A fool wouldn't have known to ask for help, Caleb. I am a lawyer's daughter. I was born to read the traps men set in ink. Sit down. We have work to do." If the first day was about survival, the second was about excavation. Abigail had claimed the small room off the kitchen as her study. Caleb had moved a heavy oak desk into it, his face a mask of silent gratitude as he watched her organize her nibs, inkwells, and the stacks of parchment she had brought from town. "I'll be out with the herd," Caleb had said that morning, lingering in the doorway. "Marcus, my foreman. He'll be around if you need water or wood. Don't go past the creek alone. Crow's men have been seen near the boundary." "I'll be fine, Caleb. Go." Left alone, Abigail began the monumental task of sorting through the archives of the Vance Ranch. Caleb had kept his papers in an old leather saddlebag tucked under his bed. It was a chaotic mess of receipts, hand-scrawled tallies of cattle sales, and more of those terrifying yellow envelopes from the land office. As she worked, the lawyer's daughter in her took over. She created a double-entry ledger, her handwriting, fine, slanted, and elegant, contrasting sharply with the rough, grease-stained papers Caleb had provided. But as she moved deeper into the records from 7 years ago, the year Caleb's father, Thomas, had died, the numbers stopped making sense. Thomas Vance had been a legend in the territory, a man who had carved a kingdom out of nothing. But the ledger told a different story. Abigail found a series of promissory notes, all signed with a shaky, frantic hand that wasn't Caleb's. They weren't for cattle or seed. They were personal markers, $50 here. 50s, 200 there. all made out to a S crow. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. She began to cross-reference the dates with the ranch's cattle sales. Every time the ranch made a profit, a corresponding debt payment was sent to Crow. By noon, Abigail had reached the bottom of the saddlebag. There, tucked into a hidden flap, she found a final, devastating document. It was a deed of trust, dated just weeks before Thomas Vance's death. Thomas Vance hadn't just been a gambler. He had wagered the very land the house sat upon. The ranch wasn't the stable fortress Caleb believed it to be. It was a house of cards, built on a mountain of debt that Silas Crow was now preparing to collapse. The king of the ridge was standing on a trapdoor, and the rope was in his neighbor's hand. Caleb returned at dusk, his face caked with dust and exhaustion. He found Abigail sitting in the study, the lamp unlit, staring out at the darkening valley. "You found something," he said, not a question but a heavy realization. Abigail turned, the ledger open on her lap. "Caleb, why did your father die?" He stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. "I told you. An accident with a horse." "Why?" "Because these papers, they don't show a man who is building a legacy. They show a man who is losing his mind, or his soul, to a card table. Silas Crow didn't just start a boundary dispute, Caleb. He's been draining this ranch for years. He thinks he owns the Vance Ranch because, according to these papers your father signed, he does." Caleb moved into the small room, his presence suddenly suffocating. He looked at the ledger, at the elegant rows of numbers that spelled his ruin. "He told me it was a loan for the winter of '58, Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. "He told me he was helping us stay afloat. He was drowning you, Caleb, slowly, so he could take the whole valley without firing a single shot." Caleb slammed his fist against the doorframe, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. "I'll kill him! I'll ride over there tonight and you'll be hanged," Abigail interrupted, her voice sharp and commanding. She stood up, her small stature a stark contrast to his looming fury. "Is that what you want? To leave this ranch to him, and leave me a widow with nothing but a stone house I can't defend?" Caleb stopped, his chest heaving. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second Abigail saw a flash of the lonely boy who had been left with a debt he couldn't read, and a name he couldn't protect. "What do we do, Abigail?" he asked, his voice raw. "You're the one with the education. You're the partner. Tell me." Abigail picked up her pen. It felt like a weapon in her hand. "We don't fight with guns, Caleb, not yet. We fight with the law. We find the original transfer. We find the witnesses to those card games. And we find out exactly what happened to your father." She reached out, her fingers tentatively brushing his sleeve. "You gave me a home, Caleb. I'm not going to let a man like Silas Crow take it away from us." Caleb looked down at her hand, then into her eyes. The deal had been survival. It had been a cold transaction. But as the fire in the kitchen stove flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the wall, the look Caleb gave her wasn't that of a rancher looking at a teacher. It was a man looking at a savior. "I'll do whatever you say, Abigail," he whispered. "Just don't let go." The morning air tasted of iron and impending frost. Abigail woke before the sun, the cold of the Montana high country seeping through the stone walls of the ranch house. She didn't stay in bed. The discoveries of the previous night, the gambling markers, the predatory loans, the shadow of Silas Crow, lay on her chest like a physical weight. In the kitchen, she found Caleb already awake. He was sitting at this table, a single lamp casting long, jagged shadows across his face. He was cleaning his Winchester, the rhythmic snick-slide of the metal parts the only sound in the room. He didn't look up when she entered, but his shoulders tensed, acknowledging her presence. "You're going to the creek," she said, not as a question but a statement. "I'm going to check the fence lines," Caleb replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Crow's men were seen near the North Bend last night. They're moving markers again." "I'm coming with you." Caleb finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. The creek water gray turned dark and turbulent. No, it's a 5-mile ride. And it's not going to be a polite conversation if we find them. Stay here with Marcus. Marcus is a foreman, Caleb, not a lawyer. And right now, you're being sued, not hunted. If you ride out there and start a gunfight over a fence post, you'll lose the ranch to the territory before the sun sets. Abigail moved to the stove, her movements brisk and determined. I know how to ride a horse, and I know how to speak the language of the men who want to take this house from you. I am the partner you paid for. Don't leave your best weapon behind. Caleb stared at her for a long beat. He looked at her small frame, then at the fierce, unwavering light in her eyes. He let out a harsh, defeated breath and slammed the lever of the rifle shut. Dress warm, he grumbled. The wind at the creek doesn't care about your education. The ride to Miller's Creek took them through the ghost woods, a stand of silver-barked aspens that had been scorched by a fire years ago. The white trunks stood like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Abigail rode Rosie, a gentle bay mare, keeping pace with Caleb's massive black stallion, Midnight. Caleb was different in the saddle. He moved as if he were part of the horse, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the scabbard. As they approached the creek, the landscape turned rugged. Miller's Creek wasn't much more than a trickle this time of year, but it carved a deep, rocky scar between the Vance land and the Crow spread. They found the ghosts before they reached the water. 3 men were hammering a cedar post into the soft earth on the Vance side of the creek. Behind them, a carriage sat idling, a black, polished brougham that looked entirely out of place in the mud and sagebrush. Caleb didn't slow down. He spurred Midnight into a gallop, the horse's hooves throwing up clods of dirt. Abigail followed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Step away from the post," Caleb roared as they skidded to a halt. His rifle was out of the scabbard, held across his saddle, though not yet leveled. The workmen froze. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, spat into the dirt. "Just following orders, Vance. This here is Crow land, according to the new survey." "I don't give a damn about a forged survey," Caleb snarled. "Cross that water now, or you'll be buried under it." The door of the black carriage opened. Silas Crow stepped out. He was the polar opposite of Caleb. Where Caleb was all raw muscle and sun-scorched skin, Silas was lean, tailored, and meticulously groomed. He wore a charcoal wool suit, a silk cravat, and a hat that cost more than Abigail's yearly salary. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they glittered with a cold intellectual malice. "Violence, Caleb? Really?" Silas said, his voice smooth and cultured, echoing the Philadelphia aristocrats Abigail had fled. "It's so expected, so primitive." Silas turned his gaze toward Abigail, lifting his hat with a flourish. "And who is this? Don't tell me the hermit of Miller's Creek has finally hired a housekeeper. Or is she the legendary wife I've heard whispered about in town?" "I am Abigail Vance," she said, her voice ringing out across the rocky bank. She nudged Rosie forward until she was level with Caleb. "And I have reviewed the promissory notes you've been using to harass this ranch, Mr. Crow. I'd be very careful about your next move. Predatory lending and document fraud are hanging offenses in this territory if the right judge hears the case." Silas's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "A school teacher with a law book. How charming. But I'm afraid you're reading the wrong chapters, my dear." He stepped closer to the creek, his boots clicking on the stones. He looked up at Caleb, his expression shifting from amusement to something far more visceral, a deep-seated, simmering resentment. "You think you're so righteous, Caleb? Sitting on this hill, playing the king of the valley? You think this land is yours by divine right, by blood." Silas laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Well, you're right about one thing. It is about blood." Caleb leveled the rifle. "Get off my land, Silas. I won't tell you again." "Your land?" Silas spread his arms wide. Caleb, you don't even know who you are. You think your father, Thomas, was a saint who built this place for his golden son? Thomas Vance was a man who couldn't keep his pants buckled or his hands off a deck of cards. Silas reached into his vest and pulled out a small, tattered photograph encased in a silver frame. He held it up, though the distance was too great for them to see clearly. My mother was the girl who worked the kitchens at the Ridge Saloon 25 years ago, Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. Thomas Vance didn't just leave her with a broken heart. He left her with me. And then he paid her off with a handful of coins to keep her mouth shut so he could keep his respectable life here. The world seemed to go silent. Even the wind stopped its howling. Abigail felt a cold shiver of dread. She looked at Caleb, whose face had gone deathly pale beneath his tan. "You're lying," Caleb whispered. "Am I?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. He didn't toss it. He walked across the shallow creek, his expensive boots soaking in the icy water, and held it up to Caleb. "This is a letter of acknowledgement signed by Thomas Vance and witnessed by the town's former doctor. He recognized me as his flesh and blood. He promised my mother a portion of this ranch as an inheritance. And since he died without a will, dear brother, I am not a creditor. I am an heir. And I am here to claim my half." Caleb stared at the paper, the letters blurring before his eyes. Letters he couldn't read, but whose power he felt like a physical blow. The rifle barrel wavered. "Brother?" Caleb choked out the word as if it were poison. "I've spent 20 years watching you live my life," Silas said, his eyes burning with a lifetime of stored-up hate. "I watched you ride the best horses, eat the best meat, and walk with the Vance name while I was the bastard in the mud. I didn't just buy those notes to bankrupt you, Caleb. I bought them to take back what was stolen from me at birth. I'm going to take this house. I'm going to take the cattle, and then I'm going to watch you crawl back to the dirt you came from." Silas turned to his men. "Finish the post. If Mr. Vance fires that gun, Marshal Whitaker will have him in a noose by dawn for murdering his own kin." Silas turned and walked back to his carriage, leaving the revelation behind him like a ticking bomb. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare of silence. Caleb didn't look at Abigail. He didn't look at the road. He rode with a slumped posture she had never seen before, a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. When they reached the barn, Caleb dismounted and began unsaddling Midnight with frantic, jerky movements. He threw the heavy leather saddle against the wall, the sound echoing like a thunderclap. "Caleb, stop!" Abigail said, stepping into the dim light of the barn. "He's my brother," Caleb said, spinning toward her. His eyes were wild. "That snake, that monster, he has my father's blood in him. All these years I thought I was protecting my father's honor, and all the while I was protecting a lie." He grabbed a pitchfork and hurled it across the barn. "I'm nothing. This ranch is a lie. I'm just the son of a gambler and a cheat." Abigail didn't flinch. She walked straight into his space, her small hands reaching out to grab his massive, shaking forearms. "Look at me, Caleb Vance." He looked down at her, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You are the man who finished this house," she said, her voice hard as flint. "You are the man who stayed when the winters were lean and the cattle were dying. Thomas Vance might have sired Silas Crow, but he didn't build this ranch alone. You did. Blood doesn't make a home, Caleb. Sweat does. Loyalty does." "He has that paper, Abigail. He's an heir." "He claims to be an heir," Abigail corrected. "A letter of acknowledgement is not a deed of title. And even if he is your brother, he has spent his life trying to destroy you. That makes him an enemy, not family." She tightened her grip on his arms, feeling the rock-hard muscle beneath the canvas. "We are going back to that study. We are going to find every loophole, every flaw in his story. Silas Crow thinks he's won because he's refined. He thinks his education makes him superior, but he's forgotten one thing." Caleb swallowed hard. "What?" "He's forgotten that he's fighting a woman who has nothing left to lose, and a man who has everything to protect. Caleb looked at her, and for the first time since the creek, the darkness in his eyes flickered. He reached out, his large, calloused hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His touch was so light, so hesitant, it made Abigail's breath hitch. "Why?" he whispered. "Why are you doing this for me? You could have taken the carriage to the station. You could have left the minute you saw the debt." Abigail didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her heart hammering for a very different reason now. "Because you were right, Caleb. I needed a home. But I didn't realize until today that a home isn't just a roof. It's the person who stands under it with you." The air in the barn grew thick with things unspoken. Caleb's hand moved from her hair to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. "Abigail," he breathed. But before the moment could break, a frantic shout came from the yard. "Boss! Boss! Come quick! The north pasture is on fire!" The spell shattered. Caleb was the rancher again, his face hardening into a mask of command. He grabbed his rifle and ran for the door. Abigail followed, her mind already shifting back to the war. Silas Crow hadn't just brought a revelation to the creek. He had brought a torch. The sky over the Vance ranch was no longer gray. It was an angry, swirling, bruised purple, choked by the thick, greasy plumes of smoke rising from the north pasture. The fire hadn't been a natural occurrence. The high plains were dry, but the way the flames licked across the ridge in a perfect, hungry line spoke of kerosene and a well-timed match. Abigail didn't stay in the house. While Caleb and Marcus galvanized the men, she tore up old bed sheets for bandages and filled every bucket she could find with water from the pump. Her lungs burned with the acrid scent of charred sagebrush, and her eyes stung. But she worked with a frantic, focused energy. She was no longer the schoolteacher from the ridge. She was the woman of this house, and the house was under siege. By the time the fire was beaten back into the dirt, the sun was a dying ember on the horizon. The north pasture was a blackened graveyard. 10 head of cattle lay dead, their carcasses bloated and smelling of scorched hair, and miles of expensive cedar fencing had been reduced to ash. Caleb returned to the yard on midnight, both horse and man coated in a thick layer of soot. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face a mask of exhaustion and silent, vibrating fury. He dismounted, his legs nearly buckling, and Abigail was there before he could fall. "Caleb," she breathed, catching his arm. He didn't speak. He allowed her to lead him into the kitchen, his heavy boots dragging on the floor. He sat at the table, the same table where they had shared their cold contract only weeks ago, and stared at his hands. They were blistered and raw, the skin peeling where he had fought the flames with nothing but a wet gunny sack. "Marcus is settling the men," Abigail said, her voice soft but steady. "I've made a liniment of lard and lavender. It will help with the stings." She began to wash the soot from his face with a warm cloth. As she worked, the silence between them grew heavy. The revelation at the creek, the claim that Silas Crow was Caleb's half-brother, hung in the air like the smoke outside. "He did this," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking like dry timber. "He's killing my land to prove he's the one who deserves it. If he's my father's son, Abigail, then the same blood that's in his hands is in mine." "No," Abigail said, her hand cupping his jaw, forcing him to look at her. "Blood is just salt and iron, Caleb. It doesn't choose who you are. Silas Crow chose to be a monster. You chose to be the man who stayed and fought for this valley. Don't you dare give him the satisfaction of thinking you're the same." Caleb leaned into her touch, a long, shuddering breath escaping him. For a moment, the rugged rancher vanished, leaving only a man who had been pushed to his absolute limit. He reached up, his charred, bandaged fingers covering hers. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Abby," he breathed. The use of her nickname, spoken with such raw vulnerability, made Abigail's heart skip. The slow-burn tension that had been simmering between them since the schoolhouse reached a fever pitch. In the dim lamplight, the distance between them felt non-existent. But before the moment could culminate, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch pulled them apart. It was Marcus. He looked older, his weathered face drawn with worry. "Boss, the men are spooked. The men are at. Riley's missing. Said he was going to check the East Spring during the fire, but he hasn't come back." Caleb straightened, the exhaustion momentarily replaced by suspicion. "Riley? He's been with us for 6 months. He knows the springs better than anyone." "Something's not right, Caleb," Abigail said, her mind already spinning. She remembered the fire, how it had started in the one area Riley had been assigned to patrol earlier that morning. "While I was tending the men's minor burns in the bunkhouse, I noticed Riley's gear was gone. His trunk was empty." Caleb's face went hard as flint. "He was a plant." "Wait," Abigail said, a memory clicking into place. "The ledger. When I was looking through the debt markers Silas Crowe held, there was one name that kept appearing as a witness to the signatures. R. Miller." Caleb blinked. "Riley's last name is Miller." Riley wasn't just a disgruntled ranch hand. He was Silas Crowe's man, placed on the Vance ranch months before Caleb had even walked into the schoolhouse. He had been the one whispering about the boundary disputes in town, the one sabotaging the fences, and the one who had likely held the match to the north pasture. "I'm going after him," Caleb said, reaching for his gun belt. "No," Abigail countered, standing her ground. "That's exactly what Silas wants. He wants you off the ranch, chasing shadows in the dark, while his lawyers move in on the house. We have the lawman coming tomorrow, Caleb. Marshal Whitaker. If we can prove Riley was working for Silas, we don't just win the land. We put Silas in a prison cell for arson." Caleb looked at the blackened window, then back at Abigail. The urge to hunt was written in every line of his body, but the trust he had begun to place in her was stronger. "Fine," he spat. "But if that snake shows his face on this porch, law or no law, I'm ending it." That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. The house felt restless, the groans of the settling timbers sounding like whispers. She sat in her study, the lamp burning low, her eyes scanning the documents again. She was looking for something, anything, that tied Riley Miller to Silas Crowe in writing. She began to look through the personal letters of Thomas Vance again. Among the gambling debts and the apologies to his mistresses, she found a small, nondescript envelope addressed to a law firm in Denver. She opened it. Inside was a canceled check made out to a private detective agency. Thomas Vance hadn't been as oblivious as Caleb thought. Thomas had suspected someone was trying to frame him for a debt he didn't owe years ago. But as Abigail reached for a fresh sheet of paper to make a note, she heard a floorboard creak in the kitchen. It wasn't Caleb's heavy, rhythmic step. This was light, hesitant. She blew out the lamp and crept to the door, her heart hammering. In the moonlight filtering through the kitchen window, she saw a figure huddled by the stove. It was the young boy, Slim, the youngest of the ranch hands, barely 17. He was digging through the bread box, his movements frantic. "Slim?" Abigail whispered. The boy jumped, nearly knocking over a chair. "Miss Rowan, I was just hungry." Abigail stepped into the light. "You're shaking, son, and you've got a pack on your back. You're leaving." Slim burst into tears, sinking into a chair. "I can't stay, ma'am. Riley. He said if I didn't help him, Silas Crowe would come for my family in town. He made me leave the gate unlatched for the kerosene wagons. I didn't want to, I swear." Abigail felt a wave of pity, but also a sharp, clarifying anger. Silas Crowe hadn't just used a spy. He had corrupted a child. "Where is Riley now, Slim? Tell me the truth, and I promise Mr. Vance won't let anyone hurt your family." Slim looked up, his eyes wide with terror. "He's at the old line cabin near Miller's Creek. He's meeting Silas there at midnight to get his pay and the deed papers Riley stole from the boss's room." Abigail's blood ran cold. The deed papers. The original grant from the territory that proved the Vance family owned the valley. Caleb had thought they were safe in the floorboard, but Riley had found them. She didn't wake Caleb. If he knew, he would ride into an ambush and never come back. She grabbed her shawl and her small ivory-handled derringer. a gift from her father she had hoped never to use. She went to the barn, saddled Rosie in the dark, and rode toward the creek. She wasn't just a partner anymore. She was the defender of the Vance legacy, and she was going to get those papers back or die trying. The silver light of a waning moon was a deceptive ally. It cast long, distorted shadows across the scrub brush, turning every twisted juniper into a lurking gunman. Abigail rode Rosie with a frantic, silent prayer on her lips. She wasn't a coward. Life had stripped that luxury from her long ago. But as the temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl with a new predatory edge, she realized the magnitude of her gamble. The line cabin was a hunched, miserable structure of rotting pine and mud-chinked stones, nestled in a blind canyon near the creek. As she approached, she saw the flicker of a fire through the cracks in the shutters. 2 horses were hitched to the rail outside, Silas Crow's expensive black gelding and Riley Miller's sturdy sorrel. Abigail dismounted 100 yards out, her boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened earth. She drew her ivory-handled derringer, the metal bitingly cold against her palm. It was a small weapon, meant for a lady's reticule, not a range war, but it was all she had. She crept toward the cabin, the smell of cheap tobacco and wood smoke filling her lungs. Pressed against the rough-hewn wall, she leaned her ear toward a gap in the chinking. "I told you, Crow, it wasn't easy," Riley's voice hissed from inside. "Vance sleeps with his eyes open. I had to wait until the fire distracted the whole damn ranch to get under the floorboards." "And you're sure this is the original grant?" Silas's voice was smooth, even in the middle of a wilderness cabin. "Signed by the territorial governor himself. Without this, Caleb Vance is just a squatter on government land. He won't have a leg to stand on when the judge arrives." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved toward the window, peering through a sliver in the shutters. There, on a scarred wooden table, lay the heavy parchment. The deed. The soul of the Vance ranch. She didn't think. She couldn't afford to. She knew Caleb would be waking soon, or perhaps Slim would lose his nerve and tell the truth. Either way, time was a luxury she didn't possess. She reached for the door handle, her mind racing through a dozen impossible plans. Could she fire into the air to spook the horses? Could she rush in and grab the paper before they realized she was there? Suddenly, a massive gloved hand clamped over her mouth, and a heavy arm wrapped around her waist, hoisting her off her feet. Abigail bit down hard on the hand, her muffled scream dying in her throat. She kicked back, her heel hitting a solid, muscular thigh. "Shh, Abby. It's me." The whisper was low, vibrating against her ear, and instantly the terror vanished, replaced by a wave of heat and relief so profound she nearly slumped in his arms. Caleb. He set her down, his face a mask of shadowed fury. He didn't say a word. He simply grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the darkness of the trees. Only when they were safely out of earshot did he whirl on her. "What in the name of God were you thinking?" he growled, his voice a vibrating tremor of suppressed rage. "I wake up, find my horse saddled and my wife gone in the middle of a night when Silas Crow is looking for someone to kill." "Riley stole the deed, Caleb," she hissed back, pointing toward the cabin. "It's in there, on the table. If we don't get it back, the law Marshal Whitaker brings won't matter. Silas will have the only paper that counts." Caleb looked at the cabin, then at the sky. The wind had shifted. It was no longer a whistle. It was a roar. The clouds were swallowing the moon, and the air had turned thick and heavy with the scent of ice. "A blue norther," Caleb muttered, his eyes wide. "We have minutes, Abigail. Minutes before this whole canyon is buried in white. The deed, Caleb." "I don't give a damn about the paper if you're frozen stiff." He grabbed her reins, leading Rosie toward the trees. "We can't make it back to the main house. Not against a norther. We have to find shelter." "But they're right there." "And they're trapped too," Caleb said, his jaw set. "Silas is a city man. He'll hunker in that cabin and hope for the best. But that cabin has a rotted roof and no insulation. If we stay here, we die with them. Move! They didn't have minutes. They had seconds. The first wave of the storm hit like a physical blow. It wasn't just snow. It was a wall of white needles that blinded the eyes and stole the breath. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a heartbeat. Caleb swung onto Midnight, reaching down to grab Abigail's hand, hauling her up behind him. "Leave Rosie. She'll find her way to the barn. She's a ranch horse. You stay with me." Abigail clung to his waist, her face pressed into the rough canvas of his coat. Midnight struggled against the wind, his powerful muscles bunching and straining as they climbed the rocky ridge behind the cabin. The world vanished. There was no sky, no earth, only the screaming wind and the man in her arms. Caleb seemed to navigate by instinct. He pushed the horse higher toward the limestone cliffs that overlooked the creek. Twice, Midnight stumbled on the slick shale, and twice Caleb's strength held them steady. "There!" Caleb shouted over the gale. He steered the horse toward a dark, jagged crack in the cliffside. It was a cave, a shallow limestone shelf tucked behind a screen of frozen brush. They skidded inside, the sudden silence of the cave floor hitting them like a benediction. Caleb slid off the horse and pulled Abigail down. She was shaking so violently she could barely stand. Her wool shawl was soaked and freezing, and her hands were blue. "Midnight, stay," Caleb commanded. The horse, exhausted and shivering, retreated to the back of the cave. Caleb didn't waste time. He gathered a handful of dry bat guano and some old desiccated juniper branches that had blown into the cave mouth. With trembling hands, he struck a match. The flame flickered, died, then caught. A small orange glow began to eat away at the darkness. "Get out of those wet clothes, Abigail," he said, his voice stripped of its anger, replaced by a quiet, lethal urgency. "Caleb, Hypothermia doesn't care about modesty," he snapped, already pulling off his own soaked coat. "We have one blanket on the saddle and our own body heat. That's it. Now move." Abigail obeyed. Her fingers were so numb she had to fumble with the buttons of her dress, her teeth chattering so hard they ached. She stripped down to her thin cotton chemise, her skin pale and goose-fleshed in the firelight. Caleb was already down to his long johns, his massive frame appearing even more intimidating in the flickering shadows. He spread his heavy wool blanket over a bed of dry pine needles he'd kicked together. "Sit." Abigail sat, and Caleb wrapped the blanket around both of them, pulling her back against his chest. The contact was electric. His skin was like a furnace, the sheer radiating heat of him seeping into her frozen marrow. She leaned back, her head tucking under his chin, as the wind screamed outside the cave mouth like a banshee. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the tiny fire and the rhythmic, heavy thud of Caleb's heart against Abigail's shoulder. Slowly, the feeling returned to her toes. The shivering subsided into a low, steady hum of awareness. "You're a fool, Abigail Rowan," Caleb whispered into her hair. His voice was no longer rough. It was raw. "You could have been killed. If Silas had seen you—" "I couldn't let him take it, Caleb," she murmured, her eyes watching the flames. "Everything you've worked for, everything your father, even if he was a liar, he built this. You built this. It was the only thing I had to give you." Caleb's arms tightened around her, his hands, vast and warm, clasping over her stomach. He went still for a moment, then he let out a long, ragged sigh. "I didn't pick you, because you were the only woman left, Abby." Abigail went still. "What?" Caleb's grip tightened as if he were afraid she might pull away. 2 years ago, I came into town for supplies. It was the middle of May. You were sitting on the steps of that schoolhouse with Sarah Miller. She was crying because she couldn't get her sums right, and the other kids had teased her. Abigail remembered that day. Sarah had been heartbroken. "I stood across the street behind the livery, and I watched you," Caleb continued, his voice low and rhythmic. "I watched you take her hand. You didn't yell. You didn't tell her she was slow. You sat there for an hour in the heat, drawing numbers in the dust with a stick until she smiled. I saw the way you looked at her, like she was the most important person in the world. Abigail's breath hitched. She had never known. I went home that night and looked at this house, Caleb said. I looked at the stone and the timber, and I realized it was just a pile of dead things. I wanted that light in here. I wanted that spirit. But I'm a man who can't read a ledger and doesn't know how to talk to a lady. I figured a woman like you, educated, fine, beautiful, would never look at a man who smelled of cows and sweat. He turned her in his arms, forcing her to meet his eyes. The creek water gray was gone, replaced by a smoldering silver heat. I waited, Caleb whispered. I waited until I saw the school board starting to turn on you. I waited until I knew you were as lonely as I was. That proposal wasn't a business deal, Abigail. It was a desperate man's only chance to get the one thing he ever truly wanted. Caleb, I lied to you, he said, his forehead dropping to hers. I said I didn't want romance. I said I wanted a partner. But the truth is, I have been in love with you since the day you drew those numbers in the dust. I just didn't know how to say it without sounding like a fool. Abigail felt a tear slide down her cheek, but it wasn't from the cold. She reached up, her fingers tracing the hard, weathered line of his jaw. You're not a fool, Caleb Vance. You're the strongest man I've ever known. And you're the only man who ever truly saw me. She pulled his head down, her lips meeting his in the firelight. The kiss wasn't hesitant. It was a collision of years of loneliness and weeks of building tension. It tasted of wood smoke and salt, of survival and something much deeper. Outside, the storm raged, burying the world in ice. But inside the limestone cave, the cold deal had finally irrevocably burned away. The world that emerged from the blue norther was a crystalline, blinding white purgatory. The roar of the wind had been replaced by a silence so profound it felt heavy, broken only by the occasional sharp crack of a frozen tree limb snapping under the weight of the ice. Inside the limestone cave, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing orange eyes. Abigail woke to the steady, comforting thrum of Caleb's heart beneath her ear. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the deed, the fire, and the man named Silas Crow. She was simply a woman held by a man who had loved her from the shadows for 2 years. Caleb stirred, his arms tightening around her. He pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his breath warm against her hair. The storm's broken, he whispered. But the snow is deep. We'll have to move slow. They dressed in the dim light, the intimacy of the night before hanging between them like a golden thread. Caleb helped Abigail lace her boots, his massive hands surprisingly nimble. When they stepped out of the cave, the sun was a cold, brilliant coin in the sky. Midnight, the stallion blew plumes of steam from his nostrils, eager to move. They rode back toward the line cabin first. Abigail's heart sank when they reached the canyon. The rotted roof Caleb had mentioned had indeed failed. The cabin was a crushed skeleton of timber under a drift of snow. "Caleb, look!" Abigail pointed to a patch of disturbed white. 2 sets of tracks, ragged and deep, led away from the ruins toward the south. Silas and Riley had survived, but they were traveling on foot, their horses likely lost or dead in the collapse. "They don't have the deed," Caleb said, his eyes scanning the debris. He dismounted and began kicking through the shattered wood and ice where the table had stood. After a frantic 10 minutes, he let out a triumphant roar. He pulled a leather satchel from the slush. Inside, protected by the heavy hide, was the territorial grant. "We have it," Abigail breathed, leaning down from the saddle to touch the parchment. "We have the truth." "Now we just have to get home," Caleb said, his face hardening, "before they find another way to burn it down." Returning to the main ranch house felt like reaching a sanctuary. Marcus and the men had cleared the yard, and smoke rose invitingly from the chimney. Marcus met them at the gate, his face etched with relief. "We thought you were gone, boss," Marcus said, taking Midnight's reins. "The Norther was a killer." "We found cover," Caleb said, glancing at Abigail with a look that made her cheeks flush. "Anything happen while we were out?" "A rider from the ridge came through just before the snow hit," Marcus said, handing Caleb a bundle of mail. "Left this for the missus. Said it was marked urgent from back east." Caleb's expression shifted, a flicker of the old insecurity returning to his gray eyes. He handed the bundle to Abigail as they entered the kitchen. Abigail sat at the table, her hands trembling as she saw the postmark, Philadelphia. It was a thick, expensive envelope, the stationery smelling of lavender and old money. She opened it, and a heavy engraved card fell out, along with a long, frantic letter. It was from Thomas, the clerk who had broken her heart 8 years ago. Thomas wasn't a clerk anymore. He had inherited his uncle's shipping fortune. He wrote of his profound regret, of his youthful folly, and his desire to rescue Abigail from the savage, lonely life he had heard she was leading in the West. He had even enclosed a bank draft for a staggering amount, enough to pay for a private rail car to bring her back to the city. Abigail read the letter in a daze. 8 years ago, this letter would have been her salvation. Now it felt like a voice from a ghost. She looked up and saw Caleb standing by the window. He was holding a piece of the letter, the bank draft, that had drifted toward him. He could read the numbers now. He could see the signature of a man from her past. "He wants you back," Caleb said, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth they had shared in the cave. "He's a rich man, Abigail. He can give you the life you were born for. Silk dresses, stone streets, a home where you don't have to fight for your life every morning." "Caleb, listen to me. I'm a man who just learned his father was a liar, and his brother is a devil," Caleb interrupted, his back to her. "I'm a man who can barely write his own name. I offered you survival because I thought you had nowhere else to go. But now you do." He turned, and the pain in his eyes was almost unbearable. "I won't hold you to a deal made in desperation, Abby. If you want to go to him, I'll take you to the station myself." Abigail stood, the letter from Philadelphia clutched in her hand. She walked over to the cast-iron stove, pulled the lid, and dropped the letter, the bank draft, and the envelope into the flames. She watched as the lavender-scented paper turned to black ash. "I didn't marry a deal, Caleb," she said, turning to him, her eyes fierce with tears. "I married a man. Thomas wants to rescue me because he thinks I'm weak. You asked me to be your partner because you knew I was strong. I'm not going back to a city that made me feel invisible. I'm staying in the home we built." Caleb stared at the stove, then at her. The tension in his massive frame snapped. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into a crushing embrace. "I thought I lost you," he choked out into her neck. "You'll never lose me," she whispered. "But we have a war to finish. And I think I know where the rest of the evidence is." The fire in the stove roared, fueled by the ghosts of Abigail's past, but the air in the ranch house remained tense. The recovery of the deed was a victory, but the revelation of Silas Crow's parentage and Thomas Vance's gambling had left a lingering rot in the foundation of Caleb's memory. "My father wasn't just a gambler," Caleb said that night, pacing the study. "He was a blackmailer's dream. If he sired Silas, and Silas knew it, what else was he hiding? Why did he keep that trunk locked until the day he died?" Abigail sat at the desk, the lawyer's daughter and her taking over. "Men like Thomas Vance don't just leave a mess, Caleb. They leave a trail. They leave it because they're afraid, and they want someone to find the truth if things go wrong." She stood up and walked into Caleb's bedroom, pointing to the heavy, iron-bound trunk at the foot of his bed. "We've looked in the trunk, Caleb, but we haven't looked at it." Caleb frowned, but he knelt beside the trunk. It was a massive piece of furniture made of dark oak and reinforced with rusted iron bands. Abigail handed him a small, thin blade from her sewing kit. "Check the corners of the inner lining," she instructed. "The weight of the trunk is wrong." I noticed it when you moved it into the study. It's too heavy for the depth of the interior. Caleb ran his fingers along the base of the trunk. He pressed, prodded, and finally, near the back hinge, he felt a slight mechanical click. A false bottom, barely 2 inches deep, popped up. Inside was a small leather-bound logbook and a series of letters tied with a black ribbon. Abigail opened the logbook. Her eyes flew across the pages, her breath hitching. This wasn't a record of cattle or grain. It was a diary of fear. "Caleb, look at the dates," she whispered. The entries began 20 years ago, shortly after Thomas Vance had won the eastern section from Silas's father, Edward Crow. May 12th, 1858. Edward came to the house tonight. He was drunk and howling about the card game. He said he'd have the land back or have my blood. He didn't know I saw the extra ace in his sleeve. I let him think I cheated so I wouldn't have to kill him in front of the boy. Caleb's face went pale. "My father knew Edward Crow cheated? He took the land as a penalty, not just a win?" "Keep reading," Abigail said, her finger trembling as she pointed to the final entries, dated just days before Thomas Vance's death 7 years ago. September 14th, 1865. Silas has grown into his father's hate. He came to the creek today. He didn't want the land. He wanted me to sign a confession saying I stole the ranch from his mother. He threatened Caleb. He said if I didn't sign, Caleb would never make it back from the winter drive. I'm meeting him tonight at the North Bend to end this. "My father didn't fall from a horse," Caleb said, his voice a ghost of a sound. "He went to meet Silas to protect me." The final entry wasn't in the logbook. It was a separate scrap of paper tucked into the very back. It was a medical report hidden all these years. Thomas Vance hadn't died of a broken neck from a fall. He had a small circular bruise at the base of his skull, the kind made by a heavy-weighted cane. The kind of cane Silas Crow carried. "Silas murdered him," Abigail said, the horror of it settling in the room. The accident was staged. The boundary dispute, the forged surveys, the debt. It was all a way for Silas to take what he couldn't win, and to cover up the fact that he killed his own father's rival. Caleb stood up, his face no longer filled with pain, but with a cold, lethal clarity. He looked like the mountains outside, hard, immovable, and dangerous. "He's not my brother," Caleb said, his voice like grinding stone. "He's the man who killed my father, and he's coming back for this house." "He has to," Abigail said, standing beside him. "We have the deed, we have this logbook. As long as we're alive, his claim is a lie and his secret is a noose. He won't wait for the law, Caleb. He'll come with everything he has." Caleb reached for his gun belt, bucking it low on his hips. He looked at Abigail, and for a moment the massive cowboy was gone, replaced by the man who had found his home. "I need you to stay in the cellar, Abby. When they come—" "No," Abigail said, her chin lifted. "I told you, I'm the partner. I know where the law stands, and I know how to hold a rifle. We don't hide, Caleb. We finish this." Caleb looked at her, the schoolteacher from the ridge, and saw the warrior she had become. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. "Then we give them hell." The air following the great norther was deceptively still, a brittle silence that seemed to wait for the first crack of a rifle to shatter it. Caleb and Abigail didn't spend the morning celebrating their survival. They spent it preparing for a funeral, either Silas Crow's or their own. "He won't come from the road," Caleb said, spreading the ranch's hand-drawn maps across the kitchen table. He pointed a scarred finger to the ridge line. "The snow is too deep for a carriage there, and he's too proud to walk. He'll come from the south, through the timber, where the wind has blown the drifts clear." Abigail stood beside him, her eyes tracing the contours of the land she had come to know through ledgers and long afternoon rides. She looked at the area known as the Devil's Throat, a treacherous stretch of alkali flats and hidden sinkholes near the creek's bend. In the summer, it was a dusty wasteland. In the winter, after a thaw and a sudden freeze, it became a bog of bottomless mud hidden under a thin, treacherous crust of ice. "How many men does he have, Caleb?" she asked. "Riley, and at least 4 others he's been keeping at his line camp. Professional guns, most likely. Men who don't care about a man's name. only his gold. Caleb's grip on his Winchester tightened. Against me, Marcus, and the three hands who didn't run. The odds aren't in our favor. Then we don't fight them on the porch, Abigail said, a cold, sharp plan forming in her mind. We fight them in the throat. You told me once that the cattle avoid that bend because the ground swallows anything heavier than a coyote. If we can lure them there, their horses will be useless and their numbers won't matter. Caleb looked at the map, then at his wife. It's a mile from the house, Abby. How do we get them there without getting caught ourselves? By giving Silas exactly what he wants, she whispered. Me. The sun was a dying orange smudge on the horizon when the first shadow moved against the white expanse of the south timber. Silas Crow didn't hide his approach. He wanted the Vance Ranch to see its doom coming. He rode at the head of 5 men, his charcoal coat stark against the snow, his weighted silver cane strapped to his saddle like a scepter. Caleb stood on the porch, alone, his rifle resting against the railing. Abigail was nowhere to be seen. "Vance!" Silas's voice carried through the icy air, thin and sharp. "The marshal won't be here until tomorrow. By then this ranch will have a new master, and you'll be buried in the land you loved so much." "You killed my father, Silas," Caleb called back, his voice steady as the mountains. "I found the logbook. I know about the North Bend. I know about the cane." Silas went still. The polished mask of the aristocrat slipped, revealing the jagged, raw hate beneath. "Then you know why I have to finish this. Men, burn the barn first. I want him to watch his kingdom turn to ash before I take his head." The hired guns spurred their horses forward, torches already lit. But as they neared the yard, a single, high-pitched whistle echoed from the ridge. Abigail appeared on Rosie, silhouetted against the rising moon. She held up the leather satchel, the one containing the original deed. "Is this what you're looking for, Silas?" she cried out. "The truth you couldn't burn?" Silas roared in fury. "Get her! Get that woman and that paper!" The hired guns, seeing an easy target and a valuable prize, turned their horses away from the fortified house and toward the ridge. Abigail didn't wait. She turned Rosie and galloped toward the creek, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. She led them straight toward the devil's throat. The snow looked solid, a pristine white blanket. But as Abigail reached the edge, she steered Rosie onto a narrow, rocky spine of limestone, the only safe passage through the flats. The men behind her, blinded by greed and the glare of the moonlight on the snow, rode straight onto the alkali crust. The first horse went down with a sickening wet thud. The ice shattered, and the animal plummeted chest-deep into the freezing, sulphurous mud. The second and third followed, their riders screaming as the ground literally vanished beneath them. "It's a bog!" one of the men yelled, struggling to free his boots from the stirrups as his horse thrashed in the mire. From the rocks above, Caleb and Marcus appeared. They didn't fire at the men, they fired into the air, the thunderous report spooking the remaining horses and sending the entire group into a panic. In the chaos, the hired guns were pinned by the very land they sought to conquer. Only Silas, sensing the trap at the last second, had pulled his gelding back. He stood on the firm ground at the edge of the flats, his face a contorted mask of rage. He saw Abigail on the limestone ridge and drew a heavy, silver-plated revolver. "You ruined everything," he screamed. He fired. The bullet whined past Abigail's ear, clipping a lock of her hair. She didn't flinch. She drew her ivory derringer, but before she could fire, a shadow loomed over Silas. Caleb had ridden midnight down the steep scree slope with a recklessness that defied gravity. He slammed into Silas's horse, sending the smaller gelding tumbling. Both men hit the frozen ground, rolling into the snow. Silas scrambled for his cane, the weighted weapon he had used to murder Thomas Vance. He swung it with a desperate, lethal strength, the silver head whistling through the air. Caleb dodged, the metal catching him on the shoulder, but he didn't stop. He tackled Silas into the mud at the edge of the throat. "My father was an old man who wanted peace," Caleb grunted, his hands finding Silas's throat. "Your father was a thief," Silas wheezed, clawing at Caleb's eyes. Caleb looked down at the man who shared his blood, but none of his soul. He saw the cowardice, the greed, and the rot that had fueled a 20-year war. With a roar of primal grief and fury, Caleb hoisted Silas up and threw him toward the sinking mud. Silas hit the mire. He struggled, his expensive suit soaking in the black slime, his weighted cane sinking out of sight. "Caleb, help me!" Silas cried. The aristocrat's poise finally shattered into the whimpering of a terrified child. Caleb stood on the firm bank, his chest heaving, his rifle held loosely at his side. Abigail rode down from the ridge, stopping beside him. She reached down and took his hand. Caleb looked at Silas, then at the deed in Abigail's lap. He looked at the house in the distance where the lights were finally coming on in the windows. "The law will decide your fate, Silas," Caleb said, his voice cold and final. "If the mud doesn't take you first." The hearing was a mere formality. Marshal Whitaker arrived at dawn with a squad of deputies, pulling Silas and his trapped men from the bog like half-frozen rats. With the original deed, Thomas Vance's logbook, and the medical report in hand, the territorial judge didn't even need an hour to reach a verdict. Silas Crow was stripped of his claims and sent to the territorial prison to await trial for the murder of Thomas Vance. Peace, long awaited and hard won, finally settled over the Vance ranch. The bullet holes in the porch were patched. The charred fences of the north pasture were rebuilt with stronger cedar. But the most significant change wasn't to the land, it was to the house. 6 months later, the Vance ranch looked different. There were curtains in the windows, blue gingham that caught the morning light. There was the sound of a hammer hitting nails down by the main road, where Caleb was finishing the roof of a small, sturdy building. Abigail walked out onto the porch, a tray of lemonade in her hands. She moved with a new, careful grace, her hand instinctively resting on the slight but unmistakable curve of her stomach. Caleb looked up from his work, a grin breaking across his weathered face. A face that looked 10 years younger since he had learned to read the marks on paper and the love in his wife's eyes. He wiped the sweat from his brow and walked toward her, his heavy boots sounding a rhythmic, comforting beat on the new grass. "Schoolhouse is almost done, Abby," he said, taking a glass from her. "The desks arrived from Denver yesterday. Marshal Whitaker says he's got 12 kids from the neighboring spreads ready to start come September." "I can't wait to see them, Caleb," she said, leaning into his side, "though I suspect I'll be a bit busy by then." Caleb's arm went around her, his vast hand covering hers on her belly. He went still, a look of profound, humbled awe crossing his face as he felt the tiny, rhythmic kick of his child. "He's got a strong kick," Caleb whispered. "A rancher's legs." "Or a teacher's restless spirit," Abigail teased. Caleb turned her to face him, his gray eyes, once cold as creek water, now glowing with a deep, permanent warmth. He looked at her, the woman who had walked into his life when he was a man drowning in a debt he couldn't read, and saw his entire world. "You saved me, Abigail," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I asked for a wife because I wanted a shield. I didn't know I was asking for a soul. And I asked for a home because I wanted to hide," she replied, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. "I didn't know I was asking for a life." They looked out over the ridge, where the high plains rolled endlessly toward the purple peaks of the Rockies. The land was beautiful, brutal, and indifferent. But it was theirs. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a legacy. "I need a wife," Caleb murmured, echoing the words he had spoken in the dusty schoolhouse all those months ago. Abigail smiled, pulling his head down for a kiss that tasted of summer rain and new beginnings. "And I need a home," she whispered against his lips. As the sun set over Miller's Creek, casting long golden shadows across the valley, the massive cowboy and the schoolteacher walked back into the house together. The deal was done. The contracts were burned, and in their place was something that would outlast the stone, the timber, and the very mountains themselves. They were finally, irrevocably, home. On this channel, we tell stories of cowboys, frontier love, family bonds, human compassion, and the quiet strength that connects people in the harshest times.
As the dust settles over the Vance Ranch and the long shadows of conflict fade into the quiet glow of a hard-earned peace, what remains is not just the end of a battle, but the beginning of understanding. This story is not merely about land or survival or even love. It is about the quiet, stubborn courage it takes to stand when everything around you is collapsing. It is about two people, one who felt invisible and one who felt incomplete, finding in each other not just shelter, but purpose. Abigail came to the West believing she had nothing left to lose, only to discover that what she truly lacked was not opportunity, but recognition. Someone who could see her strength when the world chose not to. Caleb, on the other hand, believed strength was measured in endurance, in silence, in the ability to carry burdens alone. But life has a way of teaching us that no matter how strong we are not meant to stand alone forever. The meaning of this story lies in that intersection, where pride meets vulnerability, where survival becomes connection, and where necessity slowly transforms into something far deeper. What began as a cold agreement, an arrangement built on practicality and fear, evolved into a partnership grounded in trust, respect, and ultimately, love. And that transformation is where the true heart of this story lives. There is also a powerful lesson in the way truth reveals itself. The past, no matter how deeply buried, does not disappear. It waits. It shapes the present in unseen ways until someone has the courage to confront it. Caleb's journey was not just about defending his land, it was about redefining who he was beyond his father's mistakes. And Abigail's role was not simply to support him, but to illuminate the truth that allowed him to reclaim his identity. We are reminded that family is not defined by blood alone. Blood can betray, deceive, and destroy. But loyalty, sacrifice, and shared struggle, those are the things that truly bind people together. In the end, Caleb did not win because of inheritance or strength alone. He won because he chose integrity over vengeance, and because he allowed someone else to stand beside him in the fight. Another truth this story offers is about the nature of home. A home is not built from timber or stone. It is not secured by wealth or power. A home is built through trust, through shared hardship, through the quiet moments when two people choose each other again and again, even when the world gives them every reason not to. Abigail thought she needed a place to belong. Caleb thought he needed help to survive. What they found instead was something neither of them expected, a life worth protecting together. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: strength is not always loud. It is not always found in the man who rides into battle with a gun in his hand. Sometimes it is found in the woman who refuses to back down, who uses her mind instead of force, who stands in the fire and chooses to fight in her own way. True strength is the ability to adapt, to trust, and to keep moving forward, even when fear, doubt, and pain try to hold you back. So as this story comes to an end, it leaves us with something far more valuable than a resolution. It leaves us with reflection. It asks us to consider what we would fight for, who we would stand beside, and whether we have the courage to face the truths we try so hard to avoid. Because in the end, life, much like the Wild West, is unforgiving. It will test you. It will strip you down to your core. But if you are lucky enough to find someone who stands with you in that storm, someone who sees you not as you appear, but as you truly are, then you have already found something greater than survival. You have found a reason to stay. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.